you so much for bearing with me. And I'm very pleased to now introduce Kim Szeto, who's the Program Director of Public Art at New England Foundation for the Arts and our collaborator on this series, and she will be facilitating today's conversation.
Thanks, Emma. As Emma mentioned, I'm Kim Szeto, Program Director for Public Art at the New England Foundation for the Arts. And we're so thankful for this ongoing partnership with MAPC as we continue to explore the role of public art in not only shaping how we engage with our public spaces, but also how and what we remember of these places and the ways in which art and artistic expression in public has the power to continue to shape our collective understanding of place. So I'm really honored to be joined this afternoon by our speakers today. And as we ground this discussion series on public art and public memory by starting with a conversation about the land, we recognize that although we may be meeting virtually, we acknowledge that the greater Boston region where we live and work encompasses the traditional and unceded lands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people. And we honor their ancestors, past, present, and future. This afternoon's conversation is part of our work to move beyond a few words spoken at the beginning of our meetings into action. As co-hosts, MAPC and NEFA recognize that a land acknowledgement alone is insufficient, and that as institutions working in this region, we have a role in this shared work towards collective liberation and decolonization. So as I enter into today's conversation, I'm truly humbled to be joined by our speakers today, Erin Genia, Jonathan James Perry, and Nia Holley. In today's conversation, they'll be sharing their perspectives on how the remembering and forgetting of Indigenous peoples and colonial history have shaped the landscape and collective consciousness of our region. And they'll also reflect on the role of Indigenous artists in shaping a more just understanding of our public realm. And so with that said, I'm going to hand it over to each of our panelists to share a little bit about themselves. If you could share who you are, your tribal affiliation, the land on which you're joining us from today, a little bit about your creative practice, and what has shaped your consciousness of and relationship to the land. That's kind of a lot. And yeah, feel free, we didn't decide who was going to start first, so feel free to jump in. Or maybe I'll just pick on Erin. Erin, would you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim and Emma and Nia and Jonathan. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today to have these conversations. Pidamaye, unpack Oyate. My name is Erin Genia. I am a tribal member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate and descended from the Little Traverse Bay bands of Ottawa. I live in Medford, Massachusetts, and which is the tribal territory, traditional tribal territory of the Massachusetts people. And my reservation is the Lake Traverse Reservation, which is located in South Dakota. In the 1960s, during the American Indian urban relocation period, my grandpa was an engineer. He moved to New York. And that's where my dad met my mother, who is Irish and Italian. And so I grew up mostly in New York. And I then attended college in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Olympia, Washington. And then I, in recent years, have returned to the East Coast and have been studying in Cambridge at MIT. I come from a family of artists on both sides. And I've nurtured and maintained an arts practice all my life. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, cultural worker, and community organizer, and I currently serve as artist in residence for the city of Boston. Alongside my arts practice, I've worked in the field of tribal governance and Native American higher education. And I have focused my professional efforts on Indigenous peoples, arts and culture, and heritage resources. In my work, I center Dakota philosophy and values, and I always try to, I guess I seek to amplify this powerful presence of Indigenous people on the occupied lands of the United States of America, wherever I happen to be. No, I was born in 1978. That was the year that the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. So that makes me part of this first generation of Native American people who have been able to legally practice our religions and our cultures since colonization. I take this as a sacred duty, and that often puts me at odds with dominant institutions and systems. I just wanted to share with you one piece of public art that I had made to talk about an urban Indian experience, the urban Indian experience in the city of Seattle when I lived in the Pacific Northwest. Seattle was a place, actually I'll share my screen. This is called Dakota Pride Banner. And it's in Seattle Center, or it was in Seattle Center for 1 year. And the Seattle-Tacoma area was a place that was designated as an urban relocation center for many tribes. So there's a lot of people from my tribe, the Oceti-Sakowin, who live there. And yet in public space, we don't often see images that relate to our tribal heritage. So I wanted to do something that was a celebration of that. And through this work, I began to think more deeply about public space and public art, and how we think about public space and what it means for Native people, what it meant for me. And so just thought I would share that with you. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'll just pick on the next person. Nia, would you like to share next?
Hi. Natasawa Suewayonin, Natama Napamag, Waninokish Koatuang. Hi, my name is Nia, I'm Nipmuc. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me and inviting me to this panel. I'm not calling in, but I'm Zooming from Nipmuc territory. I'm in Leicester. It was called Totade. I'm close to the Quabbin area right now. And I'm like forgetting your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you want to share a little bit about your creative practice? Yeah.
Sure. Oh, right. Okay. So I'm Nipmuc. I'm not good at public speaking, but I'm also a part of a collective called Eastern Woodlands Recreation. We are a collective of Indigenous folks throughout the Northeast, really centering Two-Spirit folks, femme folks, working to rematriate our food systems, and in doing so, rematriating our livelihoods too. And other than that, well, I guess my creative practice is really grounded in relationships and relationality in regards to not only other people, but the land too, and plants and other non-human beings. And with that, the way I like to work is really in collaboration with other people. And for me, I'm a very much a process-based person. Yeah, I'm not good at speaking. So that's kind of why I do work. I hope that my actions can kind of speak for me. So I'm having a hard time sort of translating that right now, but hopefully folks can learn more about me with what I say. We can have Jonathan speak now.
You're doing great, Nia. Yeah, so Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I had to unmute. I luckily caught myself and didn't do the, which is seems to be the thing I do initially at Zoom gatherings. Jawaniki sak natasois Jonathan Perry, Jonathan James Perry, Nitomas Aquinnah. Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I come from the Aquinnah community of the Wampanoag Nation located on Naope, which is Martha's Vineyard, the island off of the coast, off of Cape Cod. I am currently zooming in from North Providence, Rhode Island, where I share a home with my wife, Leah, who is of the Narragansett Nation. And so her people's lands are kind of where I am right now, all the way down to the Connecticut border, pretty much, her traditional territory. So I'm kind of in the three corners, I like to call it. I'm sort of right on the border between the Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and Narragansett nations, right? And actually, traditionally, a really good and important meeting point between our nations. So I'm not too far from Louis-Kossuth, which is derived from the Nipmuc language. And the English, when they tried to purchase land just a little bit north of me, they tried to purchase it from the Narragansett, and they said, well, we'll sell it to you, but you have to speak to the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag and in order to buy it. And so then they went and they did the same really with Wampanoag folks, and purchased some of the land from Wampanoag folks, but they were like, well, you have to go speak with the Nipmuc if you want to buy it. And so it's kind of funny. It seems like some places were just commonly held between nations and understood as meeting points and borderlands, and that's the way it was, and in our perspective still is. So a little bit about myself. I grew up on the coastline in the Dartmouth area, and spent a lot of time going between my family's home in Dartmouth and Martha's Vineyard, where my community is, and staying with family on both sides, and enjoying kind of a space where many generations of my family have called home for a very long time. So going back to the 1700s and even earlier, you can kind of see my family owning lands on both sides and bouncing back and forth between the islands and the mainland there. And I'm sure we did it for many thousands of years, because it's a beautiful space and it's very rich with a lot of gifts from creation. I was raised in a very artistic household. My sister's an artist, my mother's an artist, my father's a craftsperson, and an artist as well. And so I was inherently just exposed to the arts and art world, and both native and cultural traditional arts and traditional views, as well as world art from many different cultures. My mother actually went to school for art and art history, and so she was a big driving force for my sister and I growing up. I enjoyed a lot of cultural activities. I was given the opportunity to sing and dance and participate in community gatherings and feasts and celebrations all around the region. I was lucky enough to have really good teachers growing up who taught me quite a bit and inspired me and sought or caused me to seek greater levels of connection and understanding. in my community and with the neighboring nations. So that was really a huge benefit for establishing, I guess, or centering me in understanding where I come from and who I am, and how lucky I am to come from a nation that still lives within its territorial borders, which, let's be quite honest, many Native people across this continent have been relocated, pushed off their lands, and so my ancestors fought very hard and worked very hard to maintain our communities within our traditional territories. And I am very appreciative of that. And I intend to teach my son uh, that appreciation as well, because we wake up and we go to sleep in the same areas as my ancestors, going back since the glaciers and since we watched the lands form and become what they are today. And that's empowering. I have participated in a lot of museum installations, art installations, consultations. I worked for a spell in cultural historic preservation for my tribal nation, and working with federal and state agencies trying to preserve, protect ancient sites or areas of importance, or including Native people in some of the outward appearance of places, because of course that's ultimately, I think, a big goal amongst Native people, is to be visible and to be current and to be acknowledged, and to make sure that there is space in our home for us, right? And consideration of us by all people who live on our lands and live amongst us. I served for 5 terms now in my tribal government. So I'm a elected official within my tribal nation, and this is my 5th term sitting as a councilman from my tribal nation. And I don't know, there's a bunch more, but ultimately I don't have any really good slides or any really good imagery for you today. I wanted to paint a picture of who and what we are, and to take you down a road that hopefully will inspire you to pursue and to look for places and to find sites and to consider every space that you are in, where you walk, where you drive, what you look at when you're on and around our lands or other Indigenous people's lands, that you are open-minded and you recognize that there is a great and powerful and important history and a connection to an entire people and nations and governments and systems and spiritual practices that is embedded in all things in space, right? So mountains can obviously be sacred, springs, waterways, trees, certain stones, stone outcroppings, pathways. Things can be sacred and important. Things can be considered much more meaningful, but similar in some ways to monuments or to sacred installations, right? Or churches, or, these things that are sometimes taken for granted are some of the most important things that our ancestors and our people today hold dear, and will go sometimes across the country to visit, to acknowledge, to be in that space at a certain time, to do something that their many generations prior to them have been doing and that they want to continue. And so I try to instill that as well. I encourage my community to maintain those practices. I encourage my son to follow in those practices. And I encourage everyone listening to think about the inherent indigeneity of all things in our lands and in our spaces, because whether it's paved over, built on top of, spray painted, covered with drywall, it doesn't matter. It's an indigenous space, and it's connected to people and culture. And our ancestors are not wiped away, no matter how much it changes. Our ancestors are in the stone and in the wood and in the water and in the earth and in the air. We're here, and that's just the way it is. And so there are many beautiful places in my territory and on our tribal lands and on the areas that are no longer in tribal control, but are still considered our home. And yeah, I have to say that I think about those things. I think about those places, and I have strong feelings about them and a protective spirit around those places and those things, and I worry about them. And sometimes I miss the obvious connection. Like I miss things that have been removed or changed. We see that change all the time. And I think for a lot of people who don't have a deep-rooted cultural or spiritual connection to space, when they see a rock outcropping or a canyon change, or they see houses or businesses built in a space, they see the trees cut and land laid open, they may think, oh, it's sad to see that change, but they don't necessarily think about the effect, the scarring that it causes for Indigenous people who have much more physical, spiritual, and mental connection to that space. That there might be traditional gathering places, council stones, or meeting spaces, or the village was in that space, and the actual footprint of traditional homes still existed in that space and are now swept away. They're still there. Those impressions are there. I think of some of our teachings, like we talk about snowshoes and we talk about canoe paddles, and those things are important because they are used to move around and to allow us to live and to exist in space. But when you make a snowshoe, you weave a snowshoe very carefully with very special knots and special designs, because every step that you take in the snow creates an impression. And that care and that design work you do in your snowshoes leaves that impression as a thank you to the snow for supporting your weight and allowing you to move on it. And that impression in our views, in our practice, in our way of thinking, that mark that you make in the snow exists in that place forever. Even though the snow melts and the earth changes in that space, that impression that you make exists forever. The same with the canoe paddle. To kiss the water with your canoe paddle, essentially it's called. And so when you take your carefully made canoe paddle and you paddle it in the water, every stroke, every time that canoe paddle sets into the water, it makes a mark. And it's a sacred mark. And it's a thank you to the water for allowing you to move yourself across it. And that paddle is a way of honoring that water and saying thank you, while also allowing you to get where you need to go. And that stroke forever exists in that space. Katavatash.
Thank you so much for sharing, grounding us in who you are and your relationship to place. When we think about public art, place and relationship to place are essential. And Jonathan, your words remind me of Wendell Berry, who's an agrarian and poet who once said that there are no unsacred places, just sacred places that have been desecrated. And your words remind me of that all of our places are sacred. And yeah, just hearing you speak about centering and remembering who you are and where you've come from, that this is a collective practice. It's not something that, it's not the act of resurrecting a monument to an individual in your community. It's a communal practice of remembering the knots in the snowshoe, or the ritual of the canoe paddle. And I was wondering if each of you might want to share an example of how your communities have practiced this art of collective remembering. And how do these practices shape your collective consciousness within your communities? The awkward pause between the questions. Feel free to jump in.
I guess I can start us off with the question. Thank you, Jonathan and Nia and Kim. I guess it's something that I think about a lot, because I, as I said before, I center Dakota philosophy in what I do, and I think that it's by taking part in the activities of life and not separating those things, not compartmentalizing those things, sort of in a linear way, that things are remembered. Like, for example, with oral traditions, we pass along knowledge and cultural values and stories and practices that way. And by sharing that knowledge down, from many generations, thousands of years of generations to now, and then passing that along, you're participating in this, greater continuum that you're not separate from, that you're a part of that. And, I think that's a very different way of remembering than in Western culture, where we sort of like, we have something, we write a history and we put it in a book, and then we put the book on the shelf, or we have a monument to a historic event and we put that monument over there, and we know it's there, so we don't really have to worry about it. We can go along in our business. So it's a very different way, of knowledge, of having knowledge and remembering. I think about different time scales, thinking of time in a different way as well. Like, that there's a cyclical nature to time itself. Having your ancestors, the guidance of your ancestors with you when you take an action, when you take a step, and thinking ahead, how will my actions affect these future generations to come? So it's like a different way of thinking about time itself. And I always think back to this time for Dakota people in 1862, because it was during that time when we were expelled from our land. And, since that time, we've been living in a diaspora of reservations around the Midwest and Plains and Canada and in cities. And I think about that time, we were put in a concentration camp, survivors of the Dakota War of 1862. We were put in a concentration camp on Pike Island, which is a sacred place to Dakota people called Vidote. And that place carries our origin stories, and it's very tied to that location of at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota River. And you know, it's also now this place of sadness of the tragedies that took place there. And during that time, our people were all were leaders of the Dakota War were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history by President Abraham Lincoln. That site is also the site of Fort Snelling, which is a place that the U.S. Army used to wage its genocidal wars across the West to steal native land for settlers. And so that time period is it's a time of tragedy for our people, and everything has changed for us since that time. And some ways that is remembered are through what I guess, like in today's art language, would be called in performative acts. But really it's just these sort of performative acts are the way that Dakota people have always got together to do things. And so there's the annual horseback ride, the Dakota 38+2 horseback ride to commemorate that time. There's been the Dakota Commemorative March, which was a 150-mile walk to commemorate that forced walk that Dakota people took, you know, from our homeland of Minnesota, you know, to various places around outside of our home territory. And so there actually is a memorial to this, to the concentration camp, but it's just, it doesn't, there's no way that it could ever like do justice to that, to what happened. And so, you know, I think it's, again, it's remembering and being with yourself and with your family and with your ancestors, and thinking, you know, forward, future generations. It's in these moments of being and living and carrying that forward, that memory.
Yeah, I love that. It's the idea of the performative remembering is a way of embodying the act of remembering. And, you know, the practice of remembering. I love that you've brought time into this, because time can either, you know, sometimes time can cause our memory to fade and become fuzzy, but through active remembering, time can also afford us greater depth and perception in the way we reflect and remember and see the things that have happened in the past. So I really appreciate bringing time into this. Nia, it makes me think a little bit about the work that you've been working on. I guess the parallel would be the canoe trip that you do each year, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like what you were saying, Erin, is really reminiscent of Deer Island, and I really loved the example about the canoe that you were talking about to Jonathan in your introduction, and even with the snowshoes, really beautiful. I was like, wow. But I think, yeah, I feel like the Deer Island paddle is like a really good example of how our community practices collective remembering. And for people that aren't aware of what Deer Island is, or why anyone would be paddling there, considering it's a waste treatment plant now. During King Philip's War, the English brought a bunch of Nipmuc people and other tribal people that were living in praying towns. There was a large amount of folks that came from the native praying town. They were like put into carts, brought to canoes from the Charles River, and they were forced to paddle themselves to Deer Island, which wasn't connected to the land like it is now. And that was like in, I think the exact date is October 30th. And as we're experiencing right now, it's really cold for whatever reason. So at that point, that late in October, like I'm sure there's already frost at that point, so the ground is probably frozen. But the folks that were interned at Deer Island were mostly elders, women, and children. They weren't allowed to leave the island. They weren't allowed to like leave the island for food. There was like stories of people trying their hardest to dig for clams in the frozen soil or sand. And yeah, like it was just a terrible experience all around. So every year in October, we do a commemorative paddle from Deer Island we end up stopping in a place in Brighton because after that point, the Charles River isn't as navigable by boat. But we stop in Brighton, and sometimes there's a walk or run that happens from Deer Island all the way to a spot in Nipmuc as a way to bring our ancestors home. And kind of like with what Erin was talking about with time being this like cyclical thing and not always this linear thing that we're taught to understand. I really feel like during the paddle and also just in general and how I've kind of have understood Nipmuc history and Nipmuc being is that it's all kind of like culminative. I don't know how to say the word, but it's all together all at once. And I feel like the paddle is a good example of like being in the past, the present, and the future all at this one time, and then to be in the water too at the same time. When I was in school, I took this one class with Christina Sharp, who's a Black writer, and there's this one part in one of her books where she's talking about residence time, which is this thing with like the ocean, and I'm doing a bad job explaining, but basically in the ocean, she was talking about residence time in thinking about like the molecules or basically like the sodium content in your blood staying in the water for about 263 million years. So when we're thinking about the Atlantic slave trade, all those people that were thrown overboard or willingly jumped overboard, it was just residence time kind of puts in perspective like how they're still there alive in the water. And so ever since learning about that kind of like made the Deer Island paddle like that much more I guess tangible. And when you're thinking about the water holding memory and holding our ancestors and holding us in those moments. And often the paddles are honestly a terrible experience to paddle. Usually the weather is horrible. The last couple of years it's been freakishly like a nice paddling experience in terms of the weather, but I think that yeah, it kind of just puts everything in perspective. And I honestly don't think it should be enjoyable, but I think to speak to collective memory, to have that be like a community experience, and folks from other tribal nations often join us too, it kind of just sets the tone for future generations of kind of like what to expect and like what to continue. Also, when I think of collective memory, I think about, I grew up in Worcester, but ever since I was a baby, I was actively involved with my tribe, mainly with the Hassamissit band or Hassamisco band in Grafton, Massachusetts, which is Central Mass. And I remember being like maybe 4 or 5 at the back of my reservation, which is about like 3.5 acres of land that has never been owned by anyone but Nipmuc people. But I must have been like 4 or 5, and I was around for a reburial of our ancestors. And that doesn't often happen because of NAGPRA issues and all the, I don't know why it's a difficult process to return either people or items that don't belong to you to the people that should have them, but it is. But I think having that experience as a child kind of made me kind of understand, and especially at being at the reservation and that small piece of land being such a significant thing for Nipmuc people. I don't really know how to put words to the experience, but I think, again, I'm gonna go back to what you were saying earlier, Jonathan, with I guess learning that not the respect, but kind of understanding like your responsibility from having that experience of being able to grow up relatively within my homeland, relatively like with my community, and to be a part of experiences like that, because you just kind of see just how big the small things are, and your responsibility to uphold those and make sure that it's there 7 generations from now, at least that understanding of that responsibility to your kin, to your land, to your ancestors. So yeah, I guess that's it for me right now.
Am I next?
Yeah, I recognize we are running a little over time, but would love, Jonathan, to hear your thoughts on collective remembering, and maybe we'll take this opportunity to also share, move into sharing a little bit about the examples of public art, monuments, memorials, that are either significant to you or that you feel require some interrogation. Yeah, well, we can talk about that as well as collective memory here. That'd be great.
So I guess there's a number of things that stick out in my mind. Erin, you were talking about, remembering and continuing knowledge, and and I've heard it many times from all over, and it's always interesting how Native people work with the loss and the removal of from land. And like, our people are very adaptive, and they're strong-willed and survivors, and I guess steadfast in continuing on our terms as best as possible, right? And I think one of the things that always keeps us going, keeps us looking forward, is this idea that things are cyclical, that things are they're never ending, right? This understanding that if you lose something, if something's forgotten, it's not gone. There's a difference between forgotten and gone, right? Or removed. It's not, it's, you just get it back, right? And, you know, your language can't really die because it's rooted in the land, and it's rooted in your bones and in your blood and in your mind and in your ancestors and in everything that makes your home home, right? And so, you know, you do ceremony and you pray and you ask for guidance and you talk to your cousins and you work your way towards getting it, because it's bigger than just something that you have that you can lose. You can't lose it. You know, the idea, the knowledge and the stories that our people hold only go away when every single one of us is gone. You know, it's like our ceremonies and it's our songs and our dances. They can't be taken away until those that created it and caretook for it don't exist, and therefore they're no longer important or pertinent. They existed, and the people that specifically it meant something to are not here to carry it forward. And that's maybe when things go. And it's still not gone. It's forever there. It's just not as tangible, I suppose, right? But yeah, I think that we continue on in so many different ways, and there's so many different ways of looking at who and what we are and what our spaces are and what is meaningful. We exist in a lot of different ways, and we keep things going, and we teach and we educate our communities and ourselves in so many different ways. And you know, I think to all the efforts, I mean, I started working for the Wampanoag Indigenous program at Plymouth Plantation, the museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts, forever ago. I don't want to date myself too much, but I took a position there in 1996, so a couple of years ago. And in that time, I worked, and I honed my skill as a traditional canoe maker, dugout canoe maker, and as a result, really grew passionate about it. In that time, I was able to work on many vessels, and paddle them in the rivers, and we used to have to go and retrieve them when they washed down the river out into the ocean. And we heard stories of ones that showed up in other parts of the country, that we just said, okay, well, that dugout canoe is in New Jersey now, and that's the way it goes. It's staying there. But I was able to work on a 32-foot dugout canoe and a 20-foot dugout canoe, which in, I want to say it was 2001, I believe, we paddled to Martha's Vineyard. And for me, it was really a powerful experience, because it was the first time that our dugout canoes were used in open ocean in potentially several hundred years. I mean, at a certain point, the English outlawed dugout canoes, and they removed all the dugout canoes from Native people or destroyed them because it was a method of our people moving around. And that happened during King Philip's War. So around the time that Nia is speaking about with the Deer Island, removal of Native people to Deer Island, and the eventual, slave ship removal from the country, and that happened, unfortunately, in a lot of places. It happened, some of the islands in New Bedford Harbor were used also as internment spaces for Native people while they were being grouped together and selected, and then I guess the strongest, or what were deemed the most dangerous, were loaded onto ships and sold in the Caribbean islands, and etc. There were several Wampanoag people who actually wrote letters vying for release from Deer Island, because in the time that they were held on the island, another Native nation had actually grabbed their wives and children, and so they petitioned to be released so they could, so they could retrieve their family members. And I believe it was under they were given, at least some of them were given, the right to go and retrieve their family members, but I believe they had to turn themselves in afterwards. So just these ridiculous things, right? And those are very much memories that our communities still hold today, and are obviously very painful and powerful memories, and imprinted in spaces that we have called, sometimes sacred spaces or gathering spaces. It's kind of a marring of something that was beautiful and has been turned into a different kind of a place. We paddled across the ocean. We actually moved so rapidly in the dugout canoes across that spit of the Atlantic Ocean that we beat the people who saw us off and were supposed to meet us on the other side, using like the steamship ferries and vehicles, and moving rapidly, and we beat them. And we got to the island, and we were the only ones there, and a random family from Switzerland, I think, who were just vacationing. They just saw these dugout canoes come out of the sea, and all these native people in traditional clothes, and they didn't know what to make of it. And what was interesting is that happened, and then many years later, I was in the same dugout canoe with the same paddlers that I paddled to Martha's Vineyard in a 20-foot white pine dugout in the Charles River, paddling out to Deer Island during a small craft advisory, and we battled 4 or 5 foot seas in Boston Harbor to get to Deer Island as part of that memorial paddle, and that acknowledgement of our ancestors, and a very important and powerful tribal nation and sister nation to the Wampanoag, which would be the Nipmuc people, are most likely our most powerful and closest allies as a people throughout history. So there's that. On a different way of remembering, and it's recorded well, would be the Moshup, the Legends of Moshup gatherings that we have in Aquinnah, where years ago, prior to electricity even being present in Aquinnah, what used to be referred to as Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard, it used to be by torchlight, these nighttime traditional stories being practiced and performed, narrated, and people would act out our traditions, our ancient stories of the creation of the islands, of a great being named Moshup, who formed and shaped the earth itself into what it is today. So it said when Moshup carried and guided our people to what becomes the island of Martha's Vineyard, he became so tired from the journeying and from literally carrying some of our people that he actually started to drag his toe. And where he dragged his toe, the earth separated, and the water rushed in, and the islands formed. So his footsteps and his movements they formed what we know as the land and the space today. And so we've told those stories at a certain time of year in the evening after the harvest, going back thousands of years. And we still do it. And now, we share it more publicly. But there's there's always a sharing of information, and there's a sharing of knowledge. It's in our tattoos, it's in our painted designs on our traditional clothes, and sometimes our contemporary clothes that we now have screen printed. It's in our houses in different ways. It's in some of the adornment that we have, the storybooks that we buy for our children. There's always creative and different ways, but we've always shared and imparted information. We've sang about it and carried it. It's what it makes us who we are as a people. And that sharing of information can sometimes just happen by yourself, sitting on some of your own land under the trees, being quiet and letting the land inform you of who you are and your place within it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And to remember that the act of remembering doesn't just begin 400 years ago with the arrival of the Mayflower, that remembering goes way before that. And the story you just shared is such a great example of that. Thank you. I know we were supposed to move into Q&A, but I would love to hear, I would love for both Nia and Erin to have a minute to share. In preparation for this conversation, we asked each of our panelists to think about a piece of public art that that is either significant to them or in need of interrogation, is how we framed it. And would love to give them some space to share about the pieces that they thought about. And maybe I'll just, for ease, I'll say I'll ask Nia to go first.
Yeah. Obviously, being in New England, there's countless examples of things that are in the public that could be considered public art that quite frankly isn't. But yeah, I was kind of going back between this one area in Boston, and then thinking about this entire town in it's Athol, off of Route 2, which is Nipmuc territory. And I had a meeting out there last winter. And before I went to the meeting, someone who lives and works out there had sent an email kind of like forewarning folks that were driving out about the signs that are all around the town. So I had looked it up, and if you just Google like Athol town signs or something like that, you'll get the history, I think it's called like the History Trail. And basically in the 70s, like the Historical Society put up a bunch of signs. And like every other New England town, there's the romanticization of like the battles against the invading Indians, or here was where so-and-so was scalped because they were trying to protect their homes from the Indians. So I was just thinking about maybe showing that or talking about that, but yeah, I mean, I don't, there's so many words to talk about New England and Massachusetts, about place and memory of place, and also and then in general, like the idea of the public too, like who is this work for? Like the community, the historical community, like who were they making those signs for? Like what was their public? That public isn't accessible to anyone but their group that decided that this was, critical historical facts that weren't even considered in, I guess maybe like a more nuanced context. I think it's really easy to paint a picture of like, it was wartime and you were, I don't know, like Indians were ravaging the town center and burning things on fire. And that's all we like learn, like so-and-so are like savages and like they were mean, or like you have Mary Rowlandson who writes an entire narrative that is just so grossly disturbing in the way that they paint a picture of my ancestors and Jonathan's ancestors, and like, and then again, if we're thinking about us being in, you know, America, any Native Americans ancestors, because it's commonly thought that we're all the same anyway. So it just makes us all look bad. And yeah, so the signs just kind of, I think also just make me think about how when we're thinking about monuments or public art, it's always a static thing. But to remember, and history isn't static, which kind of goes again to the previous point about like time and history. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm trying to follow my notes. But I just feel like with public art and how we're supposed to understand it, and with land and how like I understand it as a Nipmuc person, or if you think about it, like Indigenous ecological knowledge, ways of understanding land, like the two just, it's like the equal sign with the line through it. Like it just doesn't compare or compute or whatever, because public art and monuments kind of just interrupt that process of the land and of remembering and of nature, because it's so not a static thing. And when you just put something there for this like one thing, like about like this one event where people were just trying to defend themselves, and it's stuck like that forever in that one place, when in reality it's not, it just doesn't make sense. I don't know. I just think a lot of towns need to reevaluate their signage, basically, so it's real. But
Yeah, I'll try and weave in some of the questions here, because what you just shared really speaks to Karen Krolak's question. I'm just going to read it out loud to bring it into the space. Karen asks, I've been thinking about some of the land acknowledgement plaques around Boston University and other cultural organizations, and it strikes me that they're usually written in English rather than the language of any of the cultures being acknowledged. What are your thoughts about how Indigenous languages can or should be presented in public spaces? And I think, Nia, that gets to your point of who's this for? Yeah.
It's, if I can jump in for a moment, I think ultimately, and I did read that question, and I think it's important that there are Indigenous people involved in the spaces and are public facing that are using language, and that there is acknowledgement of Native communities in a bigger way, rather than to necessarily just grab language and include it and say, oh, work's done, move on to the next thing. We need to be comfortable, and we need to feel at home in our homes. And there is a serious lack of acknowledgement of continuing Indigenous people. I actually could not pick a specific thing that I either liked or disliked enough to bother talking about, because there is not enough representation there for it to be worth my time. If you drive through Boston, or you drive through most of Massachusetts, and that's an Indigenous name, And some of the street names are Indigenous names, and the town names are Indigenous names. They're from our languages. They have meaning. A lot of people don't even understand the meaning of the words that they're using, but they're using them daily. They're sending their mail there. It's our spaces, and those words mean something. But if the general population is not educated enough to acknowledge what it truly means and to think about Indigenous people, then it's pointless. And that's the trouble that I have with it. I've worked on a number of exhibits and installations, and unfortunately they're not permanent enough. I worked on a traditional structure in Harvard Yard, acknowledging the anniversary of what was initially an Indigenous school that then was broadened out to be accessible to both Native and non-Native, right? But for a university that is Indigenous in its origin, like the purpose for it was for the education of Native people, to be timid about public facing acknowledgement of its origin, and for there to be, I can't remember, more than a dozen meetings about building a temporary structure in Harvard Yard that is a style of structure that our people built for thousands of years, what's referred to as a weetu, and that people were so safety conscious about it, or that they were so worried that problems would occur, and that it was so outside of the norm that we would dig holes and set poles into their grass. Right. And the idea that there was all of these issues, and I'm thinking the entire time to myself, these Wetus were here for thousands of years. Indigenous people lived in this space. The university is a newcomer to our home. And if anything is an eyesore or a safety hazard, it's the university itself, and not what my ancestors did there for time immemorial. Right. And so that's kind of maybe a bit of the Indigenous perspective on all of this, until I can drive around and actually see anything worthy of our people and worthy of our societies and what we represent. There's not really much to talk about. We have a lot of work to do, and a lot of people are now caretakers and stewards of what we hold sacred, and they have a big responsibility to start thinking about things differently, and to make sure that there is room in our territories for our people.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to time, but Erin, I would love for you to be able to share a little bit about what's going on in Medford.
Sure, yeah. I just really appreciate what both of the other speakers have had to say about all of this, and this sign that I see a lot when I walk along the Mystic River, just a tiny little sign. I'm going to share my screen. Yes, just this tiny little sign that shows Rock Hill, which is a site where Nana Pashamet lived and there was a huge settlement here in Medford. There's kind of, some monuments around Medford too, including this other one here. If I can figure out how to, there we go. Yeah, this one's just like right in the middle of a neighborhood. I feel like there's so many places like this, so many monuments like this that are just kind of random, not randomly, but it feels random in the way that the settler settlements have been placed. They're not random when it comes to Indigenous people's relationship to that site, to the land, to the location of the river, to the location of the reservoir. and to other features of the natural environment. But I guess in another way, they feel that it makes the settlements themselves feel random. I just really quick wanted to say that there's, as Jonathan and Nia have said, thousands of years of history in this place. It didn't begin with colonization, and yet colonization has attempted to erase and rewrite this history and replace it with this mythology of a white cultural settler and settler supremacy, society. And I think that's doing everybody an injustice. I think that we need to be honest about our shared past. And I second what Jonathan said. We must have tribal people and tribes at the decision-making table when it comes to our spaces. That's a very important thing. These colonial systems have been set up to keep us out of them. And as we look ahead to what does justice truly mean, it means that we must address those systemic failures. So I guess one more thing I wanted to say is, this feeling of, like, I carry this feeling of sadness around with me when I see these things and see the, it's this term called solastalgia, which is like this new term recently coined to talk about the pain of experiencing extensive land transformations. And I think it's an interesting term because it can effectively express like what Native people feel at looking at our land and seeing, all of these environmental and spatial changes that have taken place that have been so destructive. As a Dakota person, it's important for me to honor the original people of the land, wherever I happen to be. And I think that is something that all of us must do. All of us who are not from this place, we all must recognize that and recognize the people whose land this is.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, because as most of us on this call are guests on this land, one thing I keep thinking about is, allyship, and how might we practice active remembering together, because it is our collective history, but it's also our collective future that we're working towards. And how can we gain, this greater depth perception as we look back, but also create greater justice as we look forward. And that work shouldn't be on the backs of just the Native people who are here with us, but our collective journey to figure out together. I'd love to just give Nia and Jonathan an opportunity to share any additional closing thoughts at this time. I know we didn't get to all the questions, and I'm so sorry to our audience that I didn't get to all of your questions, but we'll keep them on the side and figure out, how to answer them at a later point. But yeah, I'll open it back up to Jonathan and Nia.
Okay. So, yeah, I didn't really talk too much about it, but I feel like anyone who feels like going down that pathway can easily Google an image of Plymouth Rock. And I mean, it speaks for itself. And it's just one of those many, colonial washing, rebranding space into something that it doesn't even know what it is, right? I mean, just the weird tomb that's encapsulating the Plymouth Rock and the just odd use of space and the feel of it. And, this stone that was carved into 1620 English Mayflower arrival, beginning of a nation myth that everyone is kind of spoon-fed, unfortunately, and just that space doesn't feel like anything at all. to me. I look at an unfortunate semi-desecrated rock tombed up and used as a way to prove something that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I just think it's odd. I think it's very strange, and somewhat desperate. It seems ultimately just desperate to belong and to try to prove that it was all worthwhile, right? Instead of coming to terms with the good and bad of the story and the history of it and figuring out a better way forward. Owning the mistakes, owning people's views of a time period that we've moved on from. But it's trying to adhere to that. And I find it ironic that on the 400th year anniversary of celebrating supposedly the landing of people on a rock in Plymouth Harbor, we have a pandemic that doesn't allow people to even get together and acknowledge this anniversary, that it's just kind of, it's happening. We're on the 400th anniversary, but people are more involved in trying to maintain their communities and thinking about what the future will bring and trying to be healthy and take care of what's truly important. And I wonder if this is an opportunity to really evaluate who and what we are and what is important. Are these mythological stories that were created to fulfill a national agenda, or to erase people's voices, to silence people's rights, or to change the direction of a nation? Are they not meaningful anymore compared to what's truly important, which is the health and well-being and inclusion of all voices, of having true community and having meaningful discussion and discomfort for growth and those sorts of things. So, there's the sort of, kind of, as I've been alluding to, there's the physical and the non-physical monument and establishment that we I think are constantly evaluating and constantly learning from and guided by. And right now is a perfect opportunity to kind of clear our minds, to sit at home and think about what is important. And then when we do emerge, maybe we can be a better people.
Thank you. Nia, did you want to share some closing thoughts?
Like after that, I don't know, but yeah, I guess I was also thinking about land acknowledgements. I know that's like a really popular thing to do. I think it's honestly more than just saying whose land you're on. And like, for instance, I went to the School of Museum of Fine Arts. That's now School of Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts. And I think like within the last couple of years, they recently put a land acknowledgement plaque, and the information on it is completely wrong. If you're gonna do a land acknowledgement, just understand that to truly do a land acknowledgement, it has to be in relationship with the people whose land you're on. It's just, I feel like, like a couple years ago saying you're on stolen native land, like that was, ground level. But now to say like a random tribal person's land, or you invite someone to open your event to do a land acknowledgement and they're not even from that place, like I think people just need to dig a little bit deeper and do the hard work of really acknowledging the land that you're on. And it's more than, you know, a boost of you doing what everyone else is doing, but you should actually do it because it's a real thing and it has a real effect on people. And yeah, I agree with the pandemic being like a mirrored effect of what happened 400 years ago. And that's how I was kind of thinking about like when this first started and we were all shut down, but this constant push to not rest and not rethink is a lot. Because even though most of those events closed, there's still people that are doing events for Plymouth and still hounding folks to participate in them. And it's like no one learned what happened 400 years ago. So I don't know. I think people need to just do a closer look on, you know, what's happening and what has happened, and try not to have your ego in the way or your idea of what you think is right in the way, and just actually listen to people and actually respect what they're saying. Like, you don't have to agree, but you can respect them. And I think if we start there, we can, you know, truly start to acknowledge each other.
Thank you so much for your urge for self-reflection. You've given us all a lot to reflect on this afternoon. I just want to thank each of you for your participation in this conversation, for sharing your perspectives, your vision, and would love to hand it over to Erin actually to share a little bit about what's coming up tomorrow.
Thank you so much again to all of the organizers of this event and to Jonathan and Nia. It's been great to be in conversation with you. Thanks to everybody for listening into this. And I really I mentioned it in the chat as well, want to continue to have these conversations with folks who may have questions or, you know, want to know more. So I just want to say that I'm available to do that. And also in the spirit of continuing and beginning these conversations, Kim and I have been working on organizing a symposium that this is actually a pre-symposium event for this panel. And this symposium will be beginning tomorrow and going through Thursday. And it's called Centering Justice, Indigenous Artist Perspectives on Public Space. And you can go to the NIFA.org website and look at, you know, Centering Justice. And tomorrow we'll be talking, we have several Native artists from local tribes as well as tribes and other places. And tomorrow we'll be talking about the legacy of public space on occupied lands. What does public space mean in a settler colonial context? And then we'll also be talking about cultural appropriation and what cultural, you know, how cultural appropriation manifests in these conversations and in the work that Native artists are doing, particularly in public space. And then all of the artists, participating artists, will come back together and on Thursday have a conversation about what are our visions for the future of Native artists working in public art. You know, how can we address some of these issues that we brought up today, and how can we use this medium to bring about transformational change? So I just want to invite everybody to join in with those panels as well. And again, Wopira Tanka, thank you to everybody for being present today.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Nia, Erin, and Jonathan for joining us today and just sharing your thoughts and wisdom with all of us. I'm gonna hand it over to Emma, who's gonna wrap us up.
Good tapatanamu. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nia, Jonathan, and Erin, for, again, sharing your knowledge and your perspectives with all of us. This is a wonderful conversation, and I feel very honored to have been, part of it and been able to witness it. So thank you. I just wanted to make a quick closing announcement. As I mentioned previously at the start of today's event, this is actually the launch, not only the pre-symposium event for Centering Justice, but also the launch of our Public Art, Public Memory series. And so next Tuesday, September 29th, at the same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to host another webinar, Future Histories, the Case for Creative Commemoration. And this event features artists, educators, and designers speaking about how we can create space for difficult conversations that arise from legacies of oppression embedded in our existing monuments, and exploring the role that artists can take to shape the creative strategies we need to imagine the future of commemoration in this region. So it'll be a continuation of many of the things we've been discussing today. And then finally, on Tuesday, October 6th and Tuesday, October 13th, again at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting a workshop that is designed for planners, artists, activists, and municipal staff and volunteers who are interested in developing new approaches to public art and exploring the value of public and collective history as a tool for community-based research and engagement. And so this is an interactive workshop that will be facilitated by Paul Farber and Sue Mobley of Monument Lab, which is based in Philadelphia. And it will feature a range of small group discussions and activities, as well as some presentations from guest speakers who are fellows with Monument Lab. So it's designed as a two-part unit, again on 2 dates, October 6th and the 13th. So we just ask that if you're interested in participating, that you register for both sessions. And you can learn more about all of those events in the links that we have shared in the chat. And we very much hope that you will join us to continue these conversations. And thank you again for joining us today.